Democracy is often heralded as the system of rule most conducive to personal liberty. This, however, is not the case in practice. A quick survey of even Rousseauian thought reveals that the early liberals themselves were skeptical that democracy would be able to maintain liberty in the face of the consolidation of the government. They were fearful that the government would usurp the sovereignty of the people, that the prince would usurp the throne, rather than to play its part as the trustee of a power that is not its own. The modern outlook on democracy is not as skeptical, and in fact, it tends to reify democracy as a system of liberty and limited government, regardless of those flaws that were pointed out so early in its modern development. In reality, democracy is unlimited government, but today we hear all kinds of moral hand-wringing about those who want to dispose of the system of democracy, particularly those who desire limited forms of government and limited forms of power. We hear that anti-government attitudes are quote-unquote dangerous to our democracy, that the rise of certain ideas must be halted in order to preserve quote-unquote democratic principles. But what are those principles? Democracy is, at its root, the self-determination by a people of its form of government. It is the consent of a sovereign people to establish a form of government and to be represented by it. But today, democracy has increasingly come to mean the system itself, propped up by whatever means are necessary, even if they involve authoritarian intervention, such as by secret police, intelligence, or the FBI. In Rousseau's thought, it was formulated that the general will might be able to throw off the vestment of democracy, but today, in the world of reified liberalism, things have taken on a completely authoritarian character. Democracy is now the system, and it is full of securitarians who want to maintain it in perpetuity because it is the very basis of their power. The elite will not allow you to unelect democracy. They will defend it by claiming that those who advance illiberal thought are trying to undermine the will of the people. But all the while, they silently use manufactured consent to pass whatever they want, even if it clashes with the majority opinion. We're now definitely a long ways from Rousseau's assertion that the people ought to be able to self-determine its system of rule, even to choose to abolish democracy itself when it ceases to be fit for its purpose. What he feared has truly come to pass. The prince has usurped the throne. Democracy has become exposed as an authoritarian system, which it always was. According to the argumentation of Bertrand de Jouvenel, democracy's very essence is authoritarian. This wasn't clear at first when the faith in the rule of law was sufficient, but as soon as the legalistic idol was dead, it was obvious that among the ashes, the people making and interpreting the laws, the legislature and the judicial, held the true power. Hans Hermann Hoppe pointed out that democracy's role is to obscure the personal center of power, the actors who actually hold the power of command. This obscuration is so powerful that people blame each other for the abuses of power, for the passage of unscrupulous laws that upset the needs of a given interest group. The mythos is that democracy is majority rule by the people, that the vastest number get to constantly trot upon the minority, and this mythos serves to abet much violence. In the first place, there is no longer a single polity to represent. This gives rise to majority rule, in which the interest of the minority is completely discounted. The minority voter blames the majority voter, and the result is riots in the streets between the polities. Races get blamed for the decisions of people, which is part of the impetus behind the race riots that break out in America every 10 years or so. Responsibility for power has been distributed, which is of great utility to the ruling class because it can escape blame for anything. It can accrue an enormous national debt to which it will never be liable for, since in theory, the people are liable for it. All of this shows that democracy has done a great sleight of hand. In actuality, the people ought to blame the rulers, but there are so many rulers that no single one is responsible. The president gets blamed since he is the symbolic figurehead of the government, but it is really the legislature that continues to raise the debt ceiling. Who is to pay for the debt? Everyone, which means no one. Indeed, democracy, though it has pretensions to the sovereignty of the people, really only hides the fact that there is a sovereign ruling class, as Hans Hermann Hoppe pointed out in Democracy, the God That Failed. This ruling class is essentially oligarchical, and it only leeches consent from the people. They get to abuse their distributed responsibility constantly. Another assertion that people unconsciously hold about democracy is that it has done away with centralized power. But it's not like power was done away with when it was given to the people. The extent of power actually grew, as the formulators of popular sovereignty showed. Paraphrased, the logic went something like, there is no right that can be violated by the people, meaning that anything goes since all command is based on the assumed consent of the electorate. A law passed by the people is immune from the charge that it has outstripped any kind of authority, since the people are the basis of all authority. So even though the power of command is still personal, in theory, any time it becomes tyrannical, that tyranny is by consent. There is therefore no theoretical basis that the people can use to attack overreaches. This reduction of power to the masses is in contrast to the principle of divine sovereignty, in which there were rights that in principle were truly inviolable, coming from a non-human source. There used to be an objective basis against which to condemn abuses of power, and there used to be an individual trustee to be blamed in the form of the monarch. This is no longer the case. The mass of this democratic power might be called the imperium. De Jouvenel shows in his writings that democracy has an imperium. It has a domain of power that each branch fights over. They fight over the sovereignty of the people and the consent to pass laws, to make commands, and to maintain their stations. The story of democracy is this battle, which is authoritarian in character, not libertarian. The invention of the political machine was a final death blow to any belief that the people held the true sovereignty or that democracy had a libertarian bent. What wins elections is now no longer the degree to which representatives bow to the general will, but rather it is the ruling class that determines the general will through propaganda. Now, victory over the imperium is only the measure of centralized manipulation. Again, democracy is exposed as authoritarian. Because the battle over the imperium is couched in obscurant terms, hidden by elections, and shielded from public scrutiny, anything is permissible. Any law can be passed, and there is no mechanism available by which the people might be able to say no more. The problem becomes worse when parties are introduced, because parties subsume the general will of the people into the personal interest of a group of representatives with a given platform. A person may need A or B, but the parties force him to keep A and dispense with B in order to ensure electoral victory. The dominance of the general will gives way to the dominance of individual representatives and the oligarchical ruling class, and by this, anything, no matter how lofty or abusive, is possible to approach given enough forced compromises through party platforms that imperfectly mirror the general will, or even further, through manufactured consent. The personal interest of a class of people in society has always been the safeguard of liberty. It is the fortification that kept power from being totally centralized. But when personal interests give out, liberty goes down the toilet. Parties were instrumental in sublimating the personal interests of the public, and the authoritarian leanings of democracy went on the forward march. One attempt to preserve the personal interests of the people was to keep democracy quasi-aristocratic. The mechanism behind this was the limited franchise. In the United States, initially voting was a right reserved for landed white people. Some of the center-right have sought to make this a principle for their political program, to put democracy into the service of an ethno-nationalism. But that would be a mistake, because limited franchise is only a fantasy. A couple of forces intervene to make long-term limitation of franchise impossible. One of these is the obvious fact that the limitations on franchise butt up against the concept of the general will. How can a small aristocracy be the whole general will of an entire people? Obviously it cannot, so the injustice behind this is an obvious motive for the desire of the people to expand the franchise. The other force behind the expansion of franchise was the realization of politicians that they could gain votes by expanding the franchise. If a politician was personally responsible for this, then he could benefit from the support of the newly minted cadres of voters. Fascists realized this, particularly in Spain. They sought to expand the franchise to women because they could get women to support fascism by organizing women's clubs combined with attempts at propaganda. They wanted to use this phenomenon to their advantage. The result of the expansion of franchise to everyone was the predominance of proletarian, even socialist sentiment. Laws aimed at generating general equality between the races, the sexes, and the classes were inevitable, since the lowest portion of society will more easily submit to these, having much more to gain from them. Politicians also have much to gain by courting the interests of the masses rather than those of the libertarian middle class. This is the strategy of the high and the low versus the middle being carried out on the democratic stage. Today, this takes a racial form in which politicians will mail ballots to the black inner city. This is one of the reasons Trump lost his 2020 election, the sudden expansion of democracy by a patron to the black population. This is an effective way to undermine the white middle class vote and to give power whatever control that it wants. The natural conclusion of this logic is to expand voting to non-citizens, or to make as many immigrants citizens as possible while importing them from abroad en masse. Therefore, there is an incentive in the democratic system to manipulate the general will by changing its demographic composition. Again, democracy is authoritarian. It is top-down. No one has a right to cry about this or that being dangerous to democracy, because democracy is dangerous to itself. Unlimited franchise means unlimited power.